The Ohio State University administration has proposed to privatize OSU's campus parking operations by leasing them to a private operator for the next 50 years in return for an upfront cash payment of no less than $375 million. The claim is that this transaction would make available millions of dollars per year that would be invested in the academic core. The plan for the upfront payment is that it would be placed in the OSU endowment portfolio, from which some proceeds from a putative 9% average annual return would be drawn out each year to invest in academics. There are, of course, many trade-offs that must be discussed if privatizing OSU's parking operations would really yield millions of new dollars per year that could be invested in the academic core. These other issues range from the philosophical, moral, and ethical through the entirely pragmatic. However, there are no such trade-offs at all if privatization of parking would not yield millions of new dollars per year that can be invested in the academic core. The claimed availability of significant new funds for academics is therefore a key premise that needs to be checked. As a faculty senator, as a member of the Senate Fiscal Committee, and as Senate Fiscal's representative to the Ad Hoc Parking Advisory Committee that was constituted to advise the administration on this plan, I have analyzed the proposed transaction from the point of view of whether it might be a good financial deal for OSU. Will it really yield millions of extra dollars per year to invest in the academic core? Underlying my analysis is a very important idea. Not mine, but rather one I read in an article published last year in the Minnesota Law Review by Julie Royne of the University of Chicago. Simply put, from a cash flow standpoint, such a privatization transaction is a loan. OSU would borrow the upfront payment of $375 million from the private operator lender and make principal and interest payments for the next 50 years equal to the profits from parking operations that would be turned over to the private operator lender. The financial question is whether taking the loan would be better than, in effect, leasing the parking operations to ourselves under the same terms we would give the private operator lender. Now, the problem with mathematical models and spreadsheets is that numbers on the screen or the page are pretty abstract. This has made it surprisingly difficult for me to explain how the loan analysis works and why it's appropriate. Someone suggested that something more concrete might help. Not just concrete numbers, but rather a concrete demonstration of how money would flow. So we decided to make this short video for the purpose of demonstrating the relevant cash flows with flowing cash. I hope this demonstration makes it clear why, in year one, for example, there simply would not be millions of new dollars to invest in the academic core from privatizing parking. Let's consider cash flows related to parking right now in fiscal year 2012 and compare two scenarios. In the first scenario, we see what's happening this year. OSU runs parking. In the second, we imagine what would have happened this year if OSU had signed the privatization deal a year ago. My hands belong to OSU, and my assistant's hands belong to the private operator lender. Scenario 1. Parking revenues total about $28 million, as do expenses, because current pricing policy tries to keep OSU transportation and parking revenue neutral. Purely for this illustration, we divide these expenses into two parts. OSU pays $11 million in parking expenses that will be paid by the private operator lender in Scenario 2, and uses the remaining $17 million to pay for other parking-related expenses such as the campus bus service. We don't have a clear breakdown of these $17 million in retained expenses that will not be the responsibility of the private operator in Scenario 2. An important point in understanding my analysis is that it doesn't matter what this remaining $17 million is being used for this year. It's being used for something, and if OSU didn't have $17 million in parking revenues, then it would have to come up with $17 million from somewhere else to pay these expenses. Now Scenario 2, a thought experiment in which the parking privatization agreement has been signed last year. The parking operator has given OSU $375 million that's been placed in the OSU endowment portfolio. Parking revenues for the year that are now turned over to the private operator lender total $28 million, exactly as in Scenario 1. Out of this, the parking operator pays $11 million in certain expenses that are the responsibility of the private operator, exactly as in Scenario 1. What happens to the other $17 million? This is gross profit from parking operations we have turned over to the private operator lender. In other words, this is OSU's loan payment. Now, OSU still has to come up with $17 million to pay for whatever this new loan payment was used to pay for in scenario 1. Fortunately, we have $375 million in the endowment, and the OSU Board of Trustees allows 4.25% of this to be drawn out in any one year in order to protect the principal against the ravages of inflation and to buffer against the inevitable market volatility one experiences when attempting to get an annual return of 9%. So let's assume we earn 9%, about $34 million. We can responsibly draw out about 4.25% or $16 million of this. Now we use this to pay the $17 million in retained expenses and have the rest to invest in the academic core. Oops, not quite. We're actually $1 million short of paying our expenses. There are no extra millions to invest in the academic core. We already need to make up a $1 million deficit compared to scenario 1. Here's a quiz. If you went to the bank and tried to borrow $375 million as a mortgage loan for 50 years at 5%, your total payments for the 50 years would be about $1 billion. What will OSU's loan payments be for 50 years in this deal? Time's up. You guessed it, $4 billion. My analysis shows that this annual shortfall would get far worse over the years. The only way there could be millions of new dollars to invest in the academic core would be to draw from the endowment principal at a much higher rate than the Board of Trustees currently considers responsible. Sure, a policy of drawing and spending more now could be adopted, and it would yield millions of new dollars to invest in the academic core for the first few years. Yet, even assuming an impressive 9% return on the endowment portfolio, a high draw rate now would eat into the endowment principal so much that within only 10 years, no matter the draw rate, there would be an annual budget hole like the one we just demonstrated in year 1. This shortfall would need to be filled with other university funds, and the deficit would grow to be absolutely massive in the remaining 40 years as endowment returns failed to keep pace with OSU's loan payments. In other words, unless the private operator lender is willing to loan OSU far more than $375 million, perhaps $600 to $900 million or more, depending on your taste in financial assumptions, this is a bad financial deal for OSU compared to leasing the parking operations to ourselves. And this means there's no point in having a debate over the trade-off issues mentioned earlier because the entire premise underlying the proposed deal is faulty. There would not be millions of new dollars to invest in the academic core.